Listen to me. You listen. Oh. Well, it's a good thing I have my sheet over my legs. Otherwise, this would have been way more embarrassing for me. Anyway, despite that, you listen to me, you little... Listen. This guy, okay, he says that the light, because of only a sliver of the glass, and the way it enters the glass, would have this strange interaction with an electron, and therefore you would have stuff interacting differently and such. But the reflection of the way that the light changes in the glass, what I ended up telling him is, in order for this to be correct, in your assumption, the interactions have to match reality, and they don't. The only thing that affects the direction of the light is the angle originally impacting the surface of the glass. In other words, this spot right here, where it goes from being outside and transitions inside. Everything else inside obeys what is going to happen on the inside. So what's really happening here? It's a lot more simple than what he's saying, and it has nothing to do with electrons. I'll be right back.
A part of me says that maybe the electromagnetic wave gets absorbed and maybe something happens as of now. But that's not the most rigorous way to deal with this, because, when you're at the end.
No. I'll make it really plain for you. I'll make it really simple for you so you can actually know what's going on. The wave of light has the regular wiggles, as you can see here, and it's up and down, continues as it would, as long as it doesn't go through a medium. The moment it goes through into a different medium, it shifts. When it does this shift, the angular part, the side-to-side motion of this, changes. When it does that initial change, it's simply about how much the angle is of the surface that it impacted, and then it does the transformation, and if you tilt the glass in different directions, you get different amounts of refraction. Right? The reflective part goes back out the way it came in the opposite direction, in the opposite angle. Like if it came in from this side towards the edge here, then it would go out that side. That's the reflective part, and the refraction part just keeps going, but it is adjusted slightly. And that's why we see the stuff we saw in the thumbnail. And it also just saw this in the crazies part. So the thing that when he's talking about an interaction with an electron, my brain goes, what about the rest of the glass? What about how it actually works as it's going through the rest of the medium? How many more interactions? Why doesn't it do other changes as it goes through the glass? Why does it stay just straight, basically? And the answer to that is that, like I said, when it initially hits, it changes its waviness function. When it goes out the other side, the waviness function basically restores, because if it goes out at the same angle it goes in, it's like going through a complete square. It goes out one side, it changes its angle a little bit, goes out, continues. That's why we see stuff like what we see in that screenshot. So yes, true, it's not that light is going slower in glass. It's a single transformation at the entry point of the glass. And I'm pretty sure that doesn't have to do with electrons and how that works with the wobbliness and whatever else frequencies. It's just I understand, it's not just where it is in glass, it's literally everywhere in the glass. So, because the glass is so dense, like he also mentions electrons being basically, and atoms are basically like, really, there isn't that much in there. And compared to a stadium, the center of the nucleus of the atom is a very tiny dot. And again, I have another intuition for you. The electromagnetic field of the area around the atom is its own set of influences. So literally every part of the glass would have some kind of influence with the light, but it really doesn't. So why is that? Well, the initial, like I say, with the initial entry, you can see it yourself when you have pieces of glass like such as I have here. Prisms are great for these type of things because you can do a direct understanding of how they work. You see where my fingers are, and then you see where they show up. They show up as being thinner, and they show up there for some reason. But then when you see them here, the light goes straight through directly. The light that's going through on an angle obviously doesn't seem to be any normal dimensions. It's actually slightly different and weird. But when you go straight through, it's straight. So that's fun. Also, there's a nice little flower in there. That's cool. And also you can tell it from the way it affects my face, how things do there, and some parts are reflected. And then you got my big wide forehead, but then you also have things like on the top bit you get some mirroring and this weird double, like quad-eyed situation. As the light just goes in, but it also goes straight out. But there's also reflection stuff happening. So it's like, depending on those initial entry points, that's literally all it is. Because otherwise it's just see-through. The light goes straight through it. It doesn't really do anything else. That's what glass, ironically, great material that it is. You can see right through it. But then you get this odd artifact thing of how it just does that. And so you would think if it has, unlike physical matter, which has way too much stuff that it can actually reflect with, glass is a different structure. and therefore will only change stuff based on the angle of approach of the light. In fact, this is how you can make, this is fun how you can make rainbows and stuff with prisms. You can change it so that it, for example, is there a way for this to make I'm not sure. I'm not sure if you can make this isn't the right type of prism for that. I don't know. I saw some rainbows in it, but I don't know if you would be able to with this, because it's too much, because square prisms aren't going to change how the light comes out, because the way it goes in is exactly the way it's coming out. It's just skewed while it's inside. So you know that it does a single transformation when it goes in, a single transformation when it goes out. If it's a triangular prism of some other sort, or a crystal that has whatever different angle as it goes in than it goes out, then you end up with the spreading out of the light, because this edge as it goes in faces all the direct light. But as it changes and twists a little bit, just from that initial impact, when it hits the other side, and because it's going out at a different angle, I guess you can do that with it like tilted like this. You can see that weird thing that happens on the edge, like here, but on the other side, in the back. That weirdness. I don't know. But generally, like, again, it can't be interactions with electrons. It has to be something more simple. So I'm already disappointed in this video.
The day we're dealing with electric fields over here, right? When we're dealing with electric fields, we never say electric fields get absorbed. That's not how we deal with electric fields. We'll deal with it by using the superposition.
They don't get absorbed, they get translated. So it's not so much that, again, the wobbliness of the up and down turns from one frequency, which is, let's say, the length from here to here, and instead it's the length from here to here. It's a little bit shorter as it moves through. But also, instead of being as long, it's also a longer sine wave. It's not as thick, and it's not, but it is longer. So it's the same energy, it's the same stuff, but it takes a slightly different route based on that initial transformation. And then once it's in that substance, it continues on with that transformation until it goes on the outer side. Then it transforms again. There's only 2 points where that happened, inside and outside.
Principle, which is a fancy way of saying that the original electromagnetic wave just continues to go through at the speed of light as if nothing has happened. But now the oscillating electrons are oscillating charges.
When you talk about oscillating electrons, I get frustrated because there are electrons throughout this entire thing. In order for the light to be messed up, it has to be messed up as it's going through the entire thing. But it's not. It's very clear. Except for the parts where you see like the flower. The flower, you have a different structure of the glass. That's like, it's all the same thing. It's just glass that's in here. But because of the etchings and the way it's been, it's not something that's been like stuck inside of it. It's like that's been carved out of it, like little bits of shavings or something with a laser or whatever. So it's actually really freaking pretty, this. Now if you could see it like really good zoom and whatever, You'd see like the actual tiny little lines that were used to make these flowers. It's actually really pretty. Definitely suggest getting one. They're really lovely. But anyhow.
Wave will generate another electromagnetic wave. You might remember that oscillating charges are the source of electromagnetic waves. That's how electromagnetic waves get created, at least in the classical physics, right? So all these oscillating electrons will generate an electromagnetic wave, which I'm going to show as a blue wave over here. This will have the same frequency as the original wave because the electrons are oscillating at the same frequency as the original wave, and they will also be traveling at the speed of light because it's in vacuum. And when you combine these two waves interfere with each other.
Still, what happens? Literally, that's after one, like, how many rows of atoms do you have to have in glass to make it so that the light has definitely hit something, but it's still going through the rest of the glass in the same orientation, the same way. So the transformation doesn't happen all throughout the glass. Why?
To give you a combined wave, and that's the wave that is traveling through the piece of glass. This wave that is traveling.
Okay, this is what pisses me off. This is what pisses me off. This is what pisses me off. Look at that. It's skewed at the entry point. It's not skewed as it's going through it, and then it's skewed as it's exiting. This is a very obvious one transformation point and another transformation point. In order for it to be electrons interacting and stuff with the light, you would think that type of thing would happen with the entire substance of the glass, and it wouldn't just happen one way, that it would happen all over the place. But it's still as intense. It looks practically the same on the outside, meaning there was no scattering that happened in this glass, meaning there is no other interactions happening. That's because light simply does a single transformation. That's because the structure of the glass, for example, has a crystal. It's sort of crystal that it allows the light to move straight through it, uninhibited, but because of that reflective part, that one angle on the outside, like you cut it in half, you'll have all sorts of reflective parts. You'd make it smaller and smaller and smaller slivers, yeah, you'll get many multiple, but because it's a solid surface, it's a solid structure that's going through, it has the same. Imagine the glass to be like a series of honeycombs, spots, that if you go in at this angle, for example, you'll have a straight path all the way through it. But if you go on a slightly different angle, you might not go in, and then you find, once you've gone into that glass, you'll end up with a straight path that leads you straight out. But ironically, that happens with not just one section or one angle. Like, it doesn't matter where you shine it in, it'll go and travel through the glass at this angle. It could travel at any angle, ironically. So it must be very spherical type of crystals that are, or structures that exactly make it so that the light is able to go straight once it's in, and then it's unimpeded, and then it just goes out. Like, really, do you think of the difference between light as a substance and light going through the substance, light going through air, right? Even air has a certain amount of ability to reflect it all. And yeah, you get a big enough piece of air, like the entire atmosphere of the planet, you end up with stuff like blue skies. and whatever else, because it's not, even though air is not as solid as glass, it does more to the light because of its structure than what glass would do.
The piece of glass is the combined wave, and that wave is also traveling at the speed of light. So the speed has not changed, because two waves traveling at the speed of light will combine to give you a resulting wave that also travels at the speed of light. But once we look at this carefully as to how these two waves combine, we'll get the secret. We'll understand the secret of why light.
Okay, again, if you're talking about using the electrons and the substance of the thing to be adding power to light, then you should be able to make light be able to jump faster than normal speeds, because if electrons are adding anything in the way of frequency, you would think you would also be able to add it not just in the sideways motion, but in the lengthways motion, equaling to the light jolting forward a little bit. If you do that a lot, then it'll jump forward a lot, stretching out so much that a single photon would just zip through it, whereas another photon going beside it will take longer for some reason. Yeah.
It's delayed over here. All right. Now, before we can answer as to what the resulting wave looks like.
Sorry, I have to change the size of the font.
Hi there! Would you like to receive?
No, I don't. Give me a second.
The resulting wave will have the same height, it'll have the same energy as before. This is how the electron wave will line up, and I find that pretty mind-blowing that just by using energy conservation we can guess this. And turns out that when you look at the equations, that's exactly what you get, and that's one of the reasons my mind is blown, because we can use high school physics principles to deal with such incredibly complex stuff. Anyways, now the question is, what would the resulting wave look like? I know it's going to have the same height. It's going to be in such a way that it has the same height. But interestingly, let's look at where the peaks of the new wave would be. So when this interferes, you can see that this part will undergo some destruction. Here there will be some construction. So the new peak will no longer be over here. It'll be somewhere in between this peak and this peak. One way to see that is that you can kind of see that this one is trying to sort of pull this peak back. This one is trying to pull this peak forward a little bit. So eventually the new peak will be somewhere in between. And if I draw that, this
still doesn't explain the fact that why wouldn't it hit other atoms in the glass itself? Why does it only distort on the entry point and the exit point?
Is what it would look like. Let me just zoom out a little bit. All right, there we go. This is the resulting electromagnetic wave that is traveling through glass. It's traveling at the speed of light, same speed, c. It has the same height, but you can see the peak is slightly behind. And this is the reason why the light gets delayed. Let me show you, and this is the interesting part. Here it comes. So if I put this on top of that, you can see where I'm going with this. All right, so here you go. All right, so this, concentrate on the yellow one now. I'm gonna get rid of the blue one so we can concentrate on the yellow one. Okay, so without the glass piece, this is what the electromagnetic wave would have looked like. But the moment I put this glass piece, it's gonna generate the blue wave, and that blue wave is going to pull back on the electromagnetic. Because of the blue wave, the electromagnetic wave gets pulled back. Can you see that? Boom, gets pulled back. Can you see that? Pull back. And because of this pullback, the wave.
What if you thought of the photons of light as actually being photons, and their literal sideways momentum was translated into lengthwise momentum, and then when it goes out the other side, it's just converted back? And then you have to wonder what would happen if you just let it continue as compressed and compress it again and again and again. I mean, we have magnifying glasses for a reason. That's because all the light goes in on one direction and it all converges.
Has to travel more distance. And this is pulled back due to one piece of glass. There are multiple pieces of glass, each one pulls back. And here's the animation. Let me show you the animation. So below we'll see what happens without the glass plate, and above we'll see what happens when I introduce the glass plate, and we'll be able to see the difference. So here we go.
Keeps changing in the magnifying glass.
We have electromagnetic waves coming in, and now I'm going to introduce the glass plate somewhere here and see what's going to happen because of that. All right, here we go. Now, I have not shown the interference yet. Now, see what happens because of the electron wave that it produces. It's going to get pulled back. So see what happens. Here we go. Here we go. Boom. Did you see that? Did you see that? Look at that. And boom. That is the effect of the electron wave interfering with this wave, and as a result, notice the resulting wave has always been traveling at the speed of light. That did not change, but it got pulled back, and that was the result. It started it started lagging behind what it would have been without the glass plate. All right, and now I'll consider more and more glass plate, and as a result, you can see he'll keep on continuing to do that. Boom, pulls back, boom, pulls back, boom, pulls back. And that's why it takes more time to travel that distance compared to the original one. Isn't this amazing? I find this pretty amazing. And here's another thing.
Because, again, the lengthwise part translated from length to width.
All right. I'm deliberately choosing not to look into the glass plate because this is as much as we can do without any math, okay? But you can kind of sort of see that if the light is being pulled back due inside those thin glass plates, the wavelength must shrink over there. And so from this, I can pretty much say that the wavelength inside the glass should reduce. And we know from
this screen, this little bit, that it continues at that same crunched the entire way. It's not like it goes in and out and in and out. Although, is it? Hold on. No. Wait, is that actually how it's working? That it goes, that being introduced to the substance of glass, the electrons being in there, each time that it goes through a set of electrons, there's a change, and then you have the empty space again, and it changes, so each time it does that change, and then it restores. And it's only a translation. Is he right about this?
That's what happens. But now we have a much better intuition behind why that happens. Light always travels at the speed of light, but it gets pulled back, and so it has to travel. It takes longer to traverse through that path, and that's why we say it slows down. Does that make sense now? But what happens when it comes to X-rays? So let's go back to our drawing board and let's go back to that wave interference. And at this point, you should have actually asked me one question.
Well, I mean, if you think about the frequency of the X-rays versus the frequency of visible light, it's tighter, so it wouldn't be as much be able to be interfered by, well, the electron's energy wouldn't be able to influence it at all, you'd think, because its frequency is smaller than that of the electrons instead of being bigger.
I mean, you probably did, but I wouldn't know anyways. But see, when we looked at energy conservation and we said that, hey, the peaks and the valleys and valleys cannot line up because energy would be created, and the peaks and valleys can't line up because the energy will be destroyed, and therefore it has to be somewhere in between, and that's how the wave got pulled back, giving you this delay. But there's another.
Listen, constructive and destructive interference is well known. Energy being created and destroyed is well known. The heat death of the universe is a well known thing. I don't know why people say stuff can't be created and destroyed, and yet they also say creative and destructive interference in the same sentence. Baffles me.
Another way in which the energy can be conserved, instead of the blue wave being behind the peak of the yellow wave, the blue wave could have been ahead the peak of the yellow wave. I can also set it up in some.
I mean, look, depending on and the other thing is you're talking about the electrons as having the same frequency, the same like oscillation as light. Light is 150 times faster than electrons. Light moves at 3 million meters per second approximately. Electrons move at 2.2 million meters per second. So that doesn't really track that they would be able to be in that same frequency, that same phase. Instead, you would show it as one would be long and one could be long and skinny, and the other one be short but thick, and the two of them adding together could make the transformation. But you can't have it. You wouldn't say that they're both as long as each other, but just be slightly up and down. That's not no.
Such a way that the two waves interfere to give me a wave that has the same height. If this happens, and that can totally happen, based on the energy conservation logic, this can totally happen. And if this happens, then we'll find that the resulting wave will have its peak, which is slightly ahead of the original wave. And now if we bring this over here, then you can see that the wave gets pushed forward because of the interference. You see that? Boom, it gets pushed forward. And again, I can show you an animation of that, and that's the result why you can apparently travel faster through glass as well. So let me go back to the animation, and let's imagine in second case where the wave gets pushed forward. If this was what would have happened, then let's see. I'm going to introduce the glass plate now. All right, here we go. Now, due to the wave interference, it's going to push that thing forward. So keep an eye on
it. About it is because when I initially look at the way the light reflects and changes in the light, is how it enters, then it stays like that. But if it's constantly being transformed, even though it's going through individual but the distance is so small and the amount of time outside of the transformed state is minuscule that total distortion throughout is minimal. Like I still look exactly like I look. Like my eyes are still up here and all of that. You know. Well, with this piece of glass, maybe, I don't know. It also depends on where it is relative to me. But, like, I don't look like I'm too changed much. Huh.
On this, and you'll see it gets pushed forward. Boom! Due to the wave interference, it pushed forward. And that can continue to happen. I keep more and more glass. Boom! 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 Because of this, you can apparently travel faster in glass than you can cover that distance faster than you would have covered that distance without the glass. So in some sense, it feels like you're going faster through it, even though you're not breaking the speed of light. You're constantly going at the speed of light. And that's how you can have two things happening. And you can now probably guess that when it comes to visible light, you get the phase lag, And when it comes to X-rays, you get the phase lead. In other words, it pushes forward. And
wouldn't it then be possible to use certain refraction or reflection to make regular light turn into X-rays and things, and that's just how they do it? See, when I make my statement, I'm talking about the the big size things, instead of looking at what's actually happening on the atomic level, where transformation and return to normal. But the thing is, the substance is so tightly bound that the transformation state is consistent and it doesn't change back until it's finally out. That's what I understand. So what did I say again, and do I still believe my own words? In order to speak correctly about this, their assumptions and of the interactions have to match reality, and they don't. The only thing that affects the direction of the light is the angle of the original impact of the surface of the glass. That's still correct. And they don't do anything while inside the glass. That's also still... That is... The thing is, if they constantly are changing inside the glass, like for every layer, for your theory to, like, you could just make a single sliver of glass and you'll make the translation, but then some part of it will be some parts will bounce off and some parts will still go through on a different angle. Reflection and refraction. So, for your theory, oh my fucking god. I hate having to spell check my shit. Because I used, goddamn... That's Fury. Ugh. Learn to enunciate. For you, Fury. Animate doesn't. The least I can do is spell check my crap before I say it. And punctuation and all that. Doesn't make it any less correct. Except for the part where, does it actually consistently go through a transformation in the glass, changing with each bit? Or does it just change on the entry point and not once it's inside the substance, glass, and then only change when it goes on the outside, just the one time? But then my question is, why do I not have a better understanding as to how exactly that actually works? Because you think of something like a round surface, you think of stuff like simple flat reflections like you saw in the Silence of Sound video, if you saw it, which I did just now.
We now have explained intuitively to some degree how you can travel faster apparently or slower without without ever changing the speed of light. But the last question would be, why is it that in the visible light you end up...
Okay, so the signal's still going to get there before a regular signal going through just empty. The thing that pisses me off about this is that we don't have faster signals like this be found. So why is that? Or it doesn't seem that we have ever found light to travel or behave in the frequency pushes forward method. Which, like, well, why wouldn't it be able to? And then why wouldn't it be able to just stretch and stretch and stretch forever, constantly? And the answer is the more you stretch the light frequency, you're not just you have to either add in more energy to make it consistently stay at the same up and down value, but the length of it increase. Otherwise, you're just changing it from a regular visible into a smaller and smaller into the tiniest waves, which you end up with, like, yeah, you end up with X-rays. And that can be a problem. I mean, X-rays inside of a substance, why don't we use that for transmission? Probably because it's less likely to be controlled, so that can be a problem. Like 5G, the frequencies are so crazy that way and whatever. But we're using, like, microwaves somehow also. And yet I still can't understand why it's warm in my room and cold outside.
Getting pulled back, and why is it in the X-rays you end up getting pushed forward? And this is the last piece of the puzzle. And full disclosure, I don't have complete intuition on it at this point. Feynman's equations became too heavy for me, but here's my perspective, here's my take. We now need to think about forced oscillations, and here's my logic, all right? Electrons inside that piece of glass, they have a natural frequency at which they would like to oscillate, all right? This is what we call the natural frequency. It's kind of, imagine that if I could tap that electron, it would oscillate with some frequency. It's natural frequency, and that happens to be somewhere in the region of ultraviolet light. That frequency corresponds to the ultraviolet frequency in the electromagnetic spectrum. That just happens to be a fact when it comes to glass. All right. Now, what happens when you shine visible light on such electrons? Visible light has a much lower frequency compared to the frequency at which electrons would naturally tend to oscillate, right? And so as a result of that, the electron, so when you force the electron to oscillate at a lower frequency, the electrons are like, cool, I can easily oscillate like that, right? Because electrons can naturally oscillate much faster. And so they have no problem oscillating at the frequency of the visible light. So they would be pretty much oscillating in phase with the visible light, which means the wave that that electron would create should also be in phase with the visible light. So if we go back to that electron wave, it should look like this, right? Because the electron is oscillating in phase. That was confusing for me. This was the part that confused me. But then I realized this electron wave is not a wave created by one single electron. It is a wave that is created by all the electrons. The wave created by a single electron will be minuscule, right? You have to add up all the waves created by all the electrons, and that is what the blue wave is. And that's where the math gets heavy, because you have to do an integral. So the wave created by this electron would be perfectly in phase with the yellow one, right? But what about the wave created by this one at some point over here? Let's consider over here. Now, because this distance is larger, can you somehow imagine that if you consider this peak from this electron, it takes, by the time it reaches over here, because it's a slightly larger distance, this electron wave, both of these electron waves would have traveled a little forward. Does that make sense?
Okay. My understanding of electrons is they are bar magnets, tiny things. The electromagnetic field itself is a separate thing. It's like a soup that everything is encompassed by. So when you have the electrons moving, you end up with what's called phase change. They shift from being slightly, from what they were to being slightly askewed. Oh God. I'm still stuck on this. It goes through one way and it goes out the other way. It doesn't change while it's inside. If the photons of light aren't actually light, but they're waves, we know electrons are actual particles. Shut up, they are. They're actual particles. But photons are excitations in the electromagnetic spectrum, so oh God.
And so when that finally arrives over here, that peak of this electron would be slightly behind this peak created by this electron. And when these two interfere,
I would
get
think instead
the result
that the influence of the electrons is that there is kind of like I said, electrons are going 150 times slower than light. So their amount of influence is enough that while going through an electron, the space that the electrons inhabit, there's a bit of a wobble, which makes a phase change. Because the electrons are basically consistent throughout the glass, that means that the shift is consistent. And then once the light is able to go out, it's able to return to its natural state. It's not influenced anymore. If that makes any sense. It doesn't matter if it bumps into the electron itself, the aura of the electron is as big as an atom. Because the influence of the electron has to be able to at least go into the atom to be able to hold it in place. Protons hold it in place. The electrons actually push away. So you wonder more if the light would be affected by protons instead of electrons. Huh.
Peak of the resulting electron waves slightly behind. Same would be the effect of addition of the waves from this electron. Similarly, if you consider now the waves created by this electron and this electron, which is even farther away, by the time this peak of this electron reaches over there, and I know you might be losing me at this point, but again, at that point, again,
it's not that I lost you, I just totally don't agree. Listen, in the electromagnetic field wobbles of the glass, the effect is a frequency difference of glass. Because electrons are moving (150 times slower than light), their frequency can only change a tiny bit of the frequency of the light while nearby. They don't have to bump into each other, they just have to be nearby. And so that amount of nearby distortion, or disturbance I should say, is similar to be like if you, like, let's say you make a small wave in water, but then someone comes up with a big wash from like a giant board that's making a push of water towards the other side, that's going to overpower the little wave. But then you have to wonder, like, what's going on with, why don't they like totally cancel out, why do they persist? And it slightly doesn't work. So you have to think about them as each being individual influencers capable of changing it, and then once it's out of the influence area, it's back to normal. That's why it's back to normal. Unless, of course, some parts of it scatter, which can still happen.
And if I consider both these waves, they would have gone forward.
That's why
and now
some of us
their peaks
have
would arrive
stuff
at this
that
point.
is weird,
And when that interferes with the blue wave gets pulled back a little bit more.
like,
Long
line
story
there,
short,
that's
here's
a
the way to
bit of
think about it.
scatter
Long story
happening
short is
because
that
structure
the
of
electron, this
isn't
electron wave
fully
would be in
straight, otherwise it
phase,
would be very
but if you consider the
sharp as well.
waves created
It's
by
not
the
that
other
sharp
electrons,
because it's
they
being
would be
rounded up,
lagging behind, and when you interfere all
which
of
is
them,
good,
that's
'cause you don't
that's
want
how
to
it
be,
gets
like,
pulled back.
cutting yourself
Don't know if
when
it
you
made
touch
sense, but I have some intuition as it's a hand wavy explanation. And as a result, the combined wave ends up being slightly behind, giving you that delay. And that's why the visible light eventually ends up apparently slowing down. But what happens when it comes to X-rays? All right. Well, X-rays have a higher frequency than ultraviolet, which means if this electromagnetic wave was X-ray, then the electromagnetic wave would be forcing the electron to oscillate at a frequency much higher than its natural frequency. And the electron says, I can't keep up with you. So now, if this is the X-ray, it's oscillating much faster, and the electron has no choice but to oscillate with that frequency, but it won't be able to catch up. What will happen when you consider oscillations, forced oscillations, is that it'll lag behind so much such that, when it goes up, it tries to go up, but when it's going down, it'll end up going up. So you'll end up having something like this. This is how it will be. So they'll be completely out of phase. When this is peaking, this will be giving you a valley, and when this is peaking, this will be giving you a valley. So now if you consider the wave created by this electron over here, that wave would look like this, perfectly out of sync with the original wave. But when you consider the wave created by all the other electrons, it'll have the same effect.
With ultraviolet, technically you should take the same example, but it's the phase change is different, the size is different. So therefore, you would think of the electrons being the yellow actually, and the higher wave of light be the the blue.
Of pulling it back. This blue wave gets pulled back when you add up all the waves from the other electrons. And now look at it. Notice this very carefully. What happens when I pull the blue wave back from this position? I'll pull it back a little bit from this position. I'll pull it back, and you see the peak ends up lining up ahead of the original wave. And in some sense, that is the reason why when you shine light with a higher frequency than the natural frequency of the electrons, eventually the electron wave becomes ahead of the original wave, making sure the resulting wave gets pushed forward, making sure the distance gets traveled faster, giving you an apparent speed faster than light. Speed of.
Yeah, but you realize this amount of change, you gotta think about like the angle of entry. You can't just think of it being affected by stuff as on an angle all the time. You also have to consider what happens when it's straight. When it's straight, then for some reason the influence of, this does have a magnification property, I just noticed. It makes it bigger slightly. Which is ironic, it works both ways. I mean, you could go big from your perspective, but also the screen is bigger when I look at it from my perspective. It's like a bit of a magnifying glass. Very small amount of magnification or such, like literally the same words that I typed, the bottom row is like a half of the height of the font lower is how much it translates the size. So it changes in this. It spreads out unilaterally. There is a spreading effect with this light. So it doesn't actually go straight in and straight out. It distorts once it's fully out, and the concentrate is different. That's fascinating. What happens when I use this side? Does it concentrate more? Because you would think the effect would be more, depending on... Yeah, it is more, because it went through more glass. That makes sense. So it's distorted more depending on the length. So it's not fully restored. There's a change for every bit depending the length of the thing. I mean, at some point you end up with when you change frequencies like that, then you have to calculate, I mean, as long as it restores back to what it was, then you don't end up with the magnification factor on the other end, and maybe that's why you have the index of 1 be good for, and why you don't want to keep increasing as you go along, because eventually you'll just end up with a frequency that, I mean, just take it to the longest degree you can possibly think of, and fiber optic cable would, I mean, okay, you can translate it as high up as the frequency is willing and capable of going, so be stretched out and be very thin. It goes from being the yellow to being the blue, but also really long frequencies. And so the thing about that is it can do that and it can translate like that, but you also don't want to mix, when we're sending a signal of one frequency, you don't want to have it so that it looks like the result of a different frequency translated. And like there's an upper lower bound. There's only so much that you can do with that. So that's why we use singular rates, that we don't distort it too much. So when you sync a fiber optic cable, it doesn't really change how the light does anything, because you want it to be exactly, or you want it to be predictable exactly for whatever distance. It will still give you the exact same signal on the outside. It won't, like, continue to distort it the longer it goes, as we've seen with this, whereas a short length of the same substance gives a different effect than the long length. You'll see my eye get bigger from this than from this. Does that make any sense? So if you had that in with the frequencies and whatever, like, the thing is, what you could the only thing that you could do is save like a few seconds here and there, but you're really just having at that frequency, using that frequency for transmission. But really, if you're going to be emitting a certain wave frequency of light, that only gives you, at the highest peaks and value of the most frequencies, once you get into like X-rays, whatever, you can't vary it as much. So you want to incorporate as many like visible spectrum or slightly higher above, slightly below, get into the microwave range and all that, and be in a general constant. That way you can compensate if it deviates from that general constant. And stuff like cosmic rays mess up with frequencies and stuff. Because that can happen all the time. It can turn a 0 into a 1 with computers, old computers at least. And now it's way more adapting and stuff.
In vacuum. And that's why when you shine X-rays, because the apparent speed is faster than light, it bends away from the normal. And a lot of fun researching about this, definitely out of my comfort zone.
Thing about X-rays is that they are in the range that the frequency of the electron doesn't have as much of ability to bump as normal visible spectrum light or something. That it's less interfered with, and that's why it's able to go straight through you, just like a neutrino, which is fascinating. I can concede that I may or may not be wrong about how the light just continues to be translated while it's in the substance. I still think that it's an influence of the electromagnetic field from how the electrons move, versus when you're moving through air or through a vacuum, you don't have any other influencer, so that's why you don't have any changes to, frequency or length or amplitude. Frequency and amplitude. I don't know. So the thing about it is that the light would change, be askew, and it's like the portion of the light when it goes in changes to be a sine wave that's slightly smaller. Once it's in, it hasn't done any more transformation. It's already done that transformation. But then I look at this. Sorry to be so obtuse about it, but I'm almost like saying yes, he's right because of what I noticed about the observation of an actual object I have in person, which makes it really intuitive. Unlike this, which is not as intuitive actually, the physical object and its distortion of light is how, because like I can see how it changes. Like when I line it up, the top part of the message, if I line that up, it becomes a slight different. It becomes lower on the bottom than if I actually straight looked at it. And again, if I do it with this other angle, then the effect is more pronounced. So, that means there are changes throughout the entire thing, and he might be correct. But the thing is, it might still be a different mechanism than what he's saying. Time dilation still doesn't exist. I don't know. Like, it makes sense, except for when you think about what is happening actually in the substance of glass, in the consistent function of the glass. It's a certain length, right? This is actually a perfect object for this experiment. And examples. You don't want to poke your eye out with this thing, because you can't. The pokey bit is the point is quite. It will do that. Anyway, the thing is, the effect of the electromagnetic field on the electrons is different in the substance. And I think that's what's actually affecting the light. And because it's a constant, because the electromagnetic field in the substance is constantly, there is no alteration with how it is affected, versus when you have like random structure stuff, you end up with stuff like my sheet over there, my hair, skin, anything, which, like skin, you can see through your eyelids, like you can shine certain amounts of light through like paper, and even though it seems solid, like this paper, show you an example. Like, put it right up against the I don't know how to say it, but there's just more light still passing through something. I don't know. When I look, oh, the other thing is fascinating. You wet the paper, it becomes more see-through. That's more interesting than this. Like, you have glass, which is a regular reflective index and all of that, and then you have this interesting transitional stuff where it's like, suddenly I've wet it, and the amount of light that goes through is slightly more than the rest of the paper, which is constant. So it's like, what's up with the water and reflective index and that, or it being wet? Like that alone is fascinating. How it changes the color, how it makes it more see-through, depending on what it is. Like grease will make it the most see-through, as you saw from that Simpsons episode. If it's greasy, if it turns see-through, you're on your way to weight gain. Something. That's a direct quote from when Homer Simpson tried to something, and the guy was like, you know what? That's actually pretty interesting science. The just rub the meat on some paper. If it's greasy, if it turns see-through, that means it's greasy, and if it's greasy, you're on your way to weight gain. Like that science there in Simpsons turns out to be more interesting than this video. And it's one sentence. Can I find that sentence? That should be enough. Come on, where is this? Where is the Simpsons? Oh, come on. What the what am I able to find on YouTube? If it turns see-through, Like, I expected to see the first response should be the clip of The Simpsons and him talking about rub it on some paper. If it turns see-through, you're on your way to weight gain. Come on, you gotta see the. There are too many words, and the exact statement of that thing is gonna get you. The problem is the fragments of it are what it looks for, instead of the entire statement, which is what I like should fucking put quotes in it if I want it to be the whole freaking quote. The quotation should give me the Simpsons thing then. And it still doesn't. Wow, that's fucking annoying. Ah, there it is! Can I play this? Can I put the link in the description of the video?
My God, that's monstrous. I've never heard of anything so negligent. I'll have no part of it.
Can you recommend a doctor who will?
Yes.
Hi, everybody!
Hi, Dr. Nick!
Now, there are many options available for dangerously underweight individuals like yourself. I recommend a slow, steady gorging process combined with axial horizontology.
Of course.
You'll want to focus on the neglected food groups, such as the whipped group, the congealed group, and the chocotastic.
What can I do to speed the whole thing up, Doctor?
Be creative. Instead of making sandwiches with bread, use Pop-Tarts. Instead of chewing gum, chew bacon.
You could brush your teeth with milkshakes.
Hey, did you go to Hollywood Upstairs Medical College too? And remember, if you're not sure about something, rub it against a piece of paper. If the paper turns clear, it's your window to weight gain. Bye.
Oh, that's the actual phrase. Cool! We're learning something. Anyway, so that interesting thing of like it can turn see-through, but it was once the what is going on in there? That science is like literally more fascinating than what I just heard. Anyway,